Hi, and welcome to the Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Neil Geddes-Ward, and Andy Chaplin. Andy, are you there?
I am indeed. Hello, Neil. How are you doing?
I'm fine. And how are you coping in this on-off weather of rain and fog and then hot weather?
I absolutely love the rain and I love thunderstorms, so I quite like it. Some people don't like the rain, but there's a word for it. I'm gonna have to look it up. If you love the rain, there's a special word for it. I like a mix, really. I think I quite like European weather because we get everything. We get snow, we get sunshine, we get warmth, we get rain. I think it'd be quite boring if we lived in one place where it's just one weather all the time.
Well, that's true, actually, because you was talking about on your Facebook about India, the temperature's continually soaring.
Oh, God, yeah, it's about 40 degrees out there.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I've been to India. I've been there twice, and I was in there both times around the same time of year, which was October/November. And so you have it in your head, certainly coming from the UK, that it's going to be fairly cold. But you just get out there and it's still hot. And apparently the hottest time of year they get, from what we were talking to locals, it gets really hot from about January onwards, because they're slap bang right on the equator and they just don't get any variation of that hot weather. It's constantly on them. You know, even when
it's the humidity that's the killer. So you can be in somewhere like Las Vegas and be okay because it's kind of dry heat, but when you get the humidity with it, somewhere like Florida, or if you're in Asia, the monsoon season, that could be quite difficult, actually. There's some places apparently in Thailand and Vietnam that literally, if you're sweating, you go and have a shower and you come out and 20 minutes later you're sweating again. So unbearable. I hate that kind of humidity. I don't like that.
Yeah, I must admit, I did kind of dread it, but I'm kind of glad that I came back to a bit of cold weather, actually, after like 2 weeks of really hot weather and sweating it. So yeah, we've got a bit of a UK mini monsoons going on at the minute.
Well, we've got a storm, and they keep naming these weather patterns, don't they? I've forgotten what the storm is, but it's probably Keith, or I don't know, Mildred or something. It's crazy.
Georgia Mildred.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of think, how far does it go? I mean, do you call it a puddle Nigel, a gust of wind? Is it Gary? I don't know. Is it Matthew, the slight dew on the ground? Where do we draw the line with that kind of
politically correct weather now, isn't it? Transgender in weather, so it's constantly changing.
Do you know? I came across a report in France where the French education system, I get this, they're banning the use of mother and father, and they're using kind of neutral gender pronouns for this. This is a country that gives male and female attributes to inanimate objects.
That's right, they do.
So you could call a chair and a table he or she. That's fine, la, whatever. But you can't call mum and dad mum and dad, because that's politically incorrect. Madness.
Yeah, that is really crazy. Where will it end? Anyway, the matter in hand for tonight's show then. Slight different format for everybody listening. Normally we go on for 2 hours, but tonight we've got a slightly different format. We was hoping to have a guest with us tonight, Philip Kinsella, one of the other Paranormal UK radio hosts, Twin Souls Radio. He presents with his brother Ronnie, but unfortunately Philip's not feeling too great tonight, so he's had to withdraw from tonight's recording. So hope Philip will get better soon. We send you all our best wishes from the Paranormal Peep Show. But we do have our other guest, which is Ben Emlyn-Jones off the Hepamwo radio station. Are you there, Ben?
Hello, Neil. Hello, Andy. Yes, I'm here. Thanks
Hello,
for inviting
Ben.
me to the show. I'm not too well. I'm not too well, actually. I'm not like Philip, though. I mean, I'm just been under the weather for the last few weeks. I don't know why. I'll find out. But it's good to be on the show. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you for coming. It's great that you're always a bit of a regular contributor. People are starting to know your name on this station, which is good for you because it also promotes your station as well. Now, you're coming here for a reason. The reason we've decided to do this show, and we're not the only show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network to do it, is just that we thought we'd like to say our little part, and that's to do with the sudden passing of UFO researcher and author Stanton Friedman, who passed away in May. And both Philip and Ben have both spoken to him, although he's based in the United States. He was based in the United States. I think he was native Canadian, wasn't he, Ben?
Yeah, he comes originally from California, USA. But he said he has dual nationality, like many Canadians and Americans do, and he lived in Fredericton, New Brunswick, for much of the last few decades of his life. It's really sad. I mean, it was a shock. He died very suddenly. I knew he was pretty old. I knew a time was coming when we were going to have to say goodbye to him. But I didn't think it would be this quick or this sudden, because he actually announced his retirement 3 years ago. And I thought, my goodness me, he's retiring at the age of 82. And he was like, it's quite something. Most people, they're raising the retirement age an awful lot. But he just couldn't. He was so dedicated to the subject that he dedicated his life to. I don't think he could look away, even during the last couple of years. He still attended conferences and things like that, and everything that he said he wasn't going to do, because he was in this for life. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And as at the age of 84, he sadly collapsed. Actually, he was on his way home from a UFO conference. He'd been to a UFO conference somewhere in the States, and he was at Toronto Airport. He was hoping to catch a connection to New Brunswick, where he lived, and he sadly collapsed and died.
Was it a heart attack or something? Or?
Yeah, it was. Now, he had a heart attack about a few years ago, and I remember, and we were all praying for his complete recovery. He did recover, but we always knew at his age and with these sort of health problems,
everyone's got a ticket, haven't they?
Exactly. We knew that his was coming up, and we were going to have to say goodbye to him. And I'm just pleased that he did what he wanted to do. He was on, he lived his last few days of his life as he's spent the last 50 years basically going around talking about UFOs and being with people and dealing with UFO subjects. So
when did Jim Mars pass? Because he was quite recent as well, wasn't he?
That was last year. Yeah, Jim passed. I think it was last year he passed, and that was sad too, because he was another of the great old guard, and again an amazing character and a very, very amiable bloke. And he's one I never met or spoke to, sadly. Although I did meet Stan, and I spoke to Stan, which was an honour. It's amazing. Stan was the one. He really, and we talk about the Roswell Incident an awful lot. I mean, it's a story that's spawned 1,000 books, including my own. So really, Stan was the original investigator into this, because the Roswell Incident happened in July of 1947, but really it went quiet for 31 years after that. Literally nothing was said. It was in the papers for a while. Then the weather balloon story came out. Then in 1978, Stan was doing. He was at a conference, of course, a UFO conference, doing a lecture, and he was approached by someone who said, "I know a guy who's handled the wreckage of a UFO." And Stan said, "Oh, tell me more about it." And so his name's Jesse Marcel, and Stan thought that name rings a bell, and indeed it did, because of course Jesse Marcel was the guy who was involved in the whole UFO. He was basically featured in the. It's just a weather balloon story. He was basically humiliated in front of the world's media for making a fool. He's this highly intelligent intelligence officer from the 509th Bomb Group, which was the only nuclear-armed unit at the time. Couldn't be trusted to know the difference between a weather balloon and something from another world, which is absurd. And this guy basically came clean. And he says, "I'm going to tell you all about it." And hence, the rest is history. The Roswell Incident, really, that's where the publicity and the true investigation, the true public awareness of the Roswell Incident began. And then there was the book a few years later by Bill Moore and Charles Berlitz. And then, of course, everything else that's happened since then.
So with Stanton's involvement, really it was him that helped put Roswell literally on the map.
Yes. He literally, he got the ball rolling. Of course, many others have carried on from where he lived. Tom Carey, Don Schmidt, Kevin Randall, etc., including some, lots of other names that came into it. But really, it was his work that was the pioneer. He was the first one.
Now, I was going to say, you're on my Facebook, aren't you, Ben? And you're aware that recently the US Navy pilots have been seeing some very odd things and actually kind of reporting that they're seeing strange lights in the sky.
Yes.
Sure, you come across those reports, haven't you?
Yes, I did. This all kicked off in December of 2017, and of course Stan was very excited by this. I'm actually really pleased that he didn't drop off before this happened, because I think it's something good he can take with him. Because in a sense this is a vindication for everything he was involved in. And
in actual fact, Ben, I've just Googled it just now. You mentioned 2017. I'm actually looking at my birthday, May 26th, 2019, and this is the New York Times.
Yes, there's been a lot of updates since then, and indeed this year, 2019, has proven so far to be a very exciting year indeed. And Stan, well, I'm glad Stan saw some of this. He saw this happening before he passed away. I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased about that. We've had, yeah, I mean, it's only a matter of time, I think, until there's more and more public awareness. New York Times has featured it on its front page.
Yeah.
This is everything Stan was fighting for all these years. And I mean, he's been a full-time ufologist since 1970, since before most of us were born. And he's even before then, he was very, very keen on the subject. And he juggled that with his career as a nuclear physicist. And I mean, he was one of the top nuclear physicists in the country, in the world rather, and in his own country certainly. And I mean, he basically quit that in the end to do what he's doing now, which really is, it's absurd when the skeptics say, well, obviously he's in it for the money, he's trying to sell books. Well, the thing about it is, you don't never, when you're writing a book, you don't know if you're going to sell any. But one thing he was certain of, as a nuclear physicist working for a Westinghouse, for General Electric, for all these big companies, these big engineering firms, he was very well paid. He's working high up there with all the top engineers, building new aircraft, building new ships and cars and things like that. I mean, he was right up there with these people. He was very well paid indeed. There's no way he would have thrown that away for something he didn't truly believe in and truly think was important. And so, really, I would ask these skeptics, to really think twice before making these really stupid comments, because it embarrasses them as well as insulting Stan.
Yeah, and talking to the skeptics, I mean, I've just posted the article in the messenger chat, so you can have a look at that. So this guy is Lieutenant, and I believe the Americans call it Lieutenant. We say Lieutenant, but Lieutenant Ryan Graves. And he basically said these things would be out there all day. He says keeping an aircraft in the air requires a significant amount of energy. With the speeds we observe, 12 hours in the air is 11 hours longer than we'd expect. And he says these things would be. He says there. Let's have a look. He says, "Wow, man, what is that, man? Look at it fly." And he says some of them were spinning as well. This is nothing. This can't be anything that we would regard as human technology unless you delve into the kind of secret space program. But you'd think Navy pilots might be part of the secret space program, but maybe they're not. Who knows?
Also, I mean, the behaviour of these objects indicates they're not made by us. I mean, these are. Lieutenant Graves is actually the latest in a series of people to come forward and speak out. The first was Commander David Fravor, also a pilot of F-18s, off the Nimitz aircraft carrier, and this particular incident appears to be the centre of this. Although there's been more than one incident, there's been another one off the coast of Florida as well that's been reported. This was a training mission. Some pilots on a training mission saw something strange. But we are obviously there's a lot of people now speaking out, and the more who speak out, the easier it is for people. It creates an atmosphere where more and more people can speak out. There's a couple of.
Sorry, Ben, I was just going to say, but
Okay.
why are we suddenly hearing about it all officially now? Why have we got people sort of just behind the president, if you like, former defense people within the United States Pentagon? Why are they suddenly bringing forward this to the table now when we've known about it for all these years?
Could this be disclosure, maybe, like quiet disclosure, not kind of like Sun headlines, ta-da, UFOs exist, but sort of easing it into the public consciousness, kind of, yeah, we kind of know they exist, yeah, rather than kind of like a slam dunk.
There are several possibilities, and I mean, the different researchers have raised different possibilities. One is exactly as what Andy just said, that this is, in a sense, is disclosure, but it's not. They're not decided not to bombard us with everything in one go. They're sort of doing it in phases. They're releasing this material in phases. Richard Dolan has done a very interesting analysis of this. Another possibility that's a minority. Reporters have said is that this is some kind of disinformation campaign to cover up something else. That seems there are some suspicious elements with some of the reports that have come out and some of the individuals involved in it, particularly to the Stars Academy. But
what do you think they would be covering up? So what would this be to cover?
That's the question. I mean, that is the big question. And I mean, in a sense, this is a question that I've addressed at earlier instances like this. Especially several other supposedly fake things that have come out. If this is supposed to be covering something up, what is it? What and why? And there's no real answer to that because, for instance, the Majestic 12 documents, which some people say is government disinformation, I don't really see what they would hope to gain by this, because there's quite a fashionable idea going around at the moment, which is that the entire mythology is a kind of neo mythology of the modern UFO era is simply some kind of deception, which is instilled by the government, the CIA, various other intelligence agencies, to launder their far more down to earth secrets, including secret aviation projects such as spy planes. This is an idea that's proposed by people like Mark Pilkington in the book Mirage Men and the film that comes with it. It doesn't quite hold water though, because it seems a very risky gambit to draw someone's attention towards something, but the ultimate objective of deflecting it. I mean, I don't understand this. I challenged Pilkington on this once, and I said, well, how do you explain Bob Lazar then? I mean, is he disinformation? And Pilkington just said, I'm not going to discuss Bob Lazar because I don't mention him in my book. I said, right, well, unfortunately, see, so there's a lot of holes in this theory, and I'd apply this same criteria to the latest the latest release that have come out. And again, I don't see how this could be really any form of disinformation. There are some strange elements. For example, some of the video. The videos weren't published official. They're not official U.S. government publications. There's John Greenwald of the Black Vault has found that out. They are actually they were given to the TTSA by somebody who then they themselves have a kind of brought out a cropped version of it. So that's a bit odd. I don't know exactly why they're doing that. However, the Pentagon just recently, this is essentially an answer to that. So a serving officer at the Pentagon has just recently confirmed that the Advanced Aerial Threat Identification Program actually does exist. So in a sense, this is proving that the Luis Elizondo, who in his private capacity talked about this, was correct. He wasn't lying. There actually is an ATIP. So now that's an extraordinary new development.
And who's that Canadian foreign minister who came out and said that basically UFOs exist as well?
Paul Hellyer.
Paul Hellyer, that's the chap.
Yeah, the Right Honourable Paul Hellyer. Yeah, he said they're as real as the aircraft that fly above our heads. Yeah. And again, he had a background in, like Stanton Friedman, he had a background in engineering and science. He was a Minister of Defence for Canada, as you said, for a number of years.
In the 1960s, I believe.
Now he's still alive. Now he is about 96 or 97, and he's still alive. And he's writing a book actually. So let's. I'm looking forward to reading that. He still goes on tours and things like that. So he's a very hale and hearty 97-year-old. But amazing thing to say, isn't it? I mean, these people got nothing to gain by lying. Yeah. They've got everything to lose.
And the Latino governments are much more open. So with the kind of the Western European, UK, US especially, it's all kind of like national security. Can't talk about national security. But if you see some of the interviews with kind of like the Mexican pilots and Peruvian pilots, they're quite openly saying they're coming across these things, and they're trained. They know what aircraft looks like. They know what aircraft doesn't look like, and what they're coming across are strange, coloured, weird, shaped things that change color, and you know, they can start off in one shape and split into many different shapes, like 10 different things, and then come back again. You know, I've seen reports about that. So it's only really kind of like in the West and the US that kind of try and keep a lid on it. A lot of the rest of the world doesn't keep a lid on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the different there is a varying policy from various nation states over what happens. I mean, I think there is a global policy when it comes to some of the most decisive evidence. For example, crash retrievals. I think we talked about that on previous shows. But there's absolutely no doubt. I mean, to me, I mean, this last year, after a rather disappointing 2018, where everything seemed to stagnate rather, and I wondered where it was going to go. The pace is picking up enormously now. We had that remarkable TV series, Project Blue Book, which is incredible. I could talk for an hour about that. You know, and then at the same time, all this material started coming out, and I thought, what's going on? It's incredible that all this is coming out. I mean, there's been a new release just within the last few days, which is the Wilson Notes, which is a rather very interesting document. Actually, it was released by someone in Australia, but it refers to someone who was a long-term scientist working for the National NIDS, the National Investigation of something, Bob Bigelow's organization, and he had a meeting with a top military official from the Pentagon, the deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and they speak quite openly for over an hour about crash, saucers, things not made on this earth. all kinds of things, and about the fact that there's a company, there's one company was named. They didn't actually. Well, one company was involved. They didn't name it, but a particular company, maybe one of the ones that Stan was working for, is involved. I'm sure. Well, they wouldn't have told Stan, because the first thing Stanton Friedman would do as soon as they told him is he'd go and he'd put it up on his websites. They wouldn't have let him into the secret. But it's pretty obvious that this cannot be. I mean, this is the kind of smoke where there has to be fire.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other alternative. There has to be something real buried underneath this, and it seems to be coming closer and closer to the surface. Now, once that happens, I mean, it's maybe the unthinkable, and what I always thought was possible, maybe impossible, that is, willing disclosure will actually take place. In which case, I mean, we enter literally a new era. Incredibly exciting.
This is, I was going to say, this surely must, all this information that's now coming out must be making skeptics a little bit hot under the collar.
Oh, they most of them are keeping quiet about it. I mean, they just really don't have an answer for this. I haven't actually checked what they've been saying, which means they can't be making that much noise, because I do occasionally dip in and out of their media. So they have to say something at some point, and I'll have a look to see what they're saying. But really, this is irrefutable, absolutely irrefutable. I mean, they'll have to, obviously they will come up with some kind of story. They'll say it's some big hoax or something. But really, I mean, you'll never, like I say, you'll never convert the diehard skeptics, no matter what happens. However, really, their words are going to ring more and more false when it comes to the general public.
And also, should we care? I mean, actually, should we care what skeptics think, or should we just bypass them and just do what we do? Because I think we're just kind of chasing our tails, going round and round in circles, trying to prove something that people don't want to believe. And I'm taking more and more the view of, if they don't want to believe, fine, go and you little.
Yeah,
I
agree.
You have to back off on them. There's absolutely no point. Yeah, there's no point, because convincing the unconvinced, preaching to the unconvertible is a waste of energy and time. And so I tend not to try, like yourself, Andy, or I just tend to back off from them.
No,
Now you mentioned Bob Lazar earlier on. Now it's interesting that Stanton had a bit of a skepticism about Bob Lazar, interesting enough, wasn't it?
This is one thing where Stan really took a very strong stance. And I think it's his biggest major error, actually. I mean, no one's perfect, no one's perfect. He was absolutely convinced that Bob Lazar was just making everything up. Because he said that a lot of Lazar is mostly to do with Lazar's backstory. For example, Lazar gives a summary of his education, which includes places such as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is a very prestigious school of engineering. He also studies at the California Technical Institute of Technology, rather. And it's true, Lazar did some strange things, like, for example, none of his classmates seem to know him, which is odd. I mean, Lazar said, I went between this year and that year. Stan went and checked him out. He tracked down his people who were in the same year. None of them remember him, which is odd. At the same time, there was other researchers have dug up people at Caltech, particularly, who do remember Lazar. And there's even also some reports from, because he worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Now, Stan again said this wasn't true. Yeah, there's distinct evidence, a lot more evidence that Lazar was at Los Alamos. This is a highly secretive part of the military-industrial complex. For example, there's actually a payslip or a tax return with his name on. There's a phone book with his name on. He's actually reported on the in-house newspaper. There's an article about him. And now, Los Alamos does not recruit school leavers. You would have to be highly trained to get a job there. And so therefore Lazar did have some form of education. And I mean, there's other people who've examined his witness testimony, and they've said that he's passed polygraph tests. So I think this is one error Stan made. It's probably his biggest error. But like I said, even Homer nods. Nobody's perfect.
Now I've actually got a little, not exactly a story myself, but I actually tagged both of you in. I'm not going to name her, but there's a friend of mine on Facebook who's actually had some UFO activity quite recently in the past few days. I don't know if you saw my tag with that, but basically her story is she lives in Southampton, and she was this is quite interesting. She got the compulsion to wake up in the middle of the night around about 2:30, something like that, and go and look at the moon. And she says that she looked at the moon and she saw what can only be described as a cluster of orbs flying in formation towards the moon. Kind of, it was either north to south or south to north, whichever it was, but that sort of direction. And this is kind of like the Southampton area. Not only that, but she's taken some photographs of it. I'm going to paste this for you guys. Obviously, we're not going to name her because she's not actually given permission. So we're not actually going to name her, but have a look at those, and that's what she's recorded. And this has happened kind of over a succession of 2 or 3 days. The same thing has happened. She's kind of looking up at the sky after a compulsion to wake up and go and look at the sky, and she's seeing these clusters, and she says that they're moving far faster than normal aircraft. And they just don't look like normal aircraft. She's also got corroborating witnesses. So she's got a friend of hers who's also out and has also started seeing things as well. Her literal post is, if you're a sky watcher in Southampton, look up now, north to south. Oh my god.
Oh my goodness. Right. Unfortunately, the link doesn't seem to work. Maybe it could be this could be the old hang on, it's because I'm not logged in. So
okay.
It could be because I'm not logged
conspiracy
in.
there then.
No, well, it might not be. I'll just see if it works in this one. But I mean, there are more and more people obviously having these experiences. They're seeing stuff. And it's like, I see it now. Yeah, I can see. Yeah. Yes, I can see this. I know this lady. Actually, I know her.
No, yeah.
She is she's actually a contactee, and she's actually reported several very strange experiences which she's had, and so it doesn't surprise me because she often has this kind of these kinds of experiences, and so.
Scroll down and look at some of her coloured ones. There's some very odd ones. There's some red and green ones. Now I know what the skeptics would say, not that I really care what they say, but they're going to say, oh, red and green, that's going to be aircraft, the aircraft lights. Well, red and green would be on either tip of the wing, whereas what she's taken is a big red orb and a big green orb. So there's not red and green together, they're separate, which doesn't make sense. Very odd. Very, very odd.
That's I mean, she's obviously an experienced sky watcher, so she knows. She knows the sky. Once you do it regularly, you get to know what's up in the sky. And most people who make mistakes when they're sky watching and see aircraft and other things, it usually tends to be in the early on when they first start.
Yeah,
because most people just don't look at the sky, do they? Most people just
bottom of life, don't they?
Yeah, they look down at their ground. They look down the ground. They don't even bother. So when you start looking at the sky and you're not used to it, it kind of it can be something new.
Also, if she was getting woken up in the middle of the night, it would suggest that that's the time when planes aren't actually flying out of Southampton Airport or anything like that.
Well, yeah. Again, that's
and not only that, it's can we really realistically pinpoint it down to coincidence that she just so happens to wake up, just so happens to be having a compulsion to look at the moon, and it just so happens that when she does, that's when she sees the cluster. I'd like to see the skeptics blow that one out of the water. Really,
it's I mean, they will come up with something, and the imagination skeptics actually shows
absolutely. We see what we want to see in the sky.
They have an ability. They have an ability to concoct reasons. I mean, unbelievable reasons in some cases to explain anything. Now, if they can explain the Rendlesham Forest incident as a lighthouse. They can explain this lady's experience. They can explain anything, basically. And they could say if a UFO landed on the proverbial White House lawn, they will literally say, oh, it must be Baron Trump's birthday, and that's a bouncy castle. And if they say, well, his birthday's not till next year, oh, yeah, but they thought they'd get in there and have the party early or something. They'll come up with something.
A practice party, yeah.
Do not expect everyone to be convinced by anything at all.
With the science that Stanton had behind him in his research, that must have given him a lot of credibility because he just wasn't your average UFO researcher. He had a nuclear physicist kind of credentials. So that must have stood him in good ground. I mean, I remember reading one of his books, Flying Saucers, the Science of Flying Saucers or something like that, where, there was lots of questions where skeptics would say, well, how can they get from there to here? And I can't remember the answer he gave, actually, but I remember he talked a thing about the hot potato scenario about UFOs making sudden stops and then turning left and right and things like that. And he said, technically, it is possible to endure that kind of force because he said it's like a hot potato. You take it out of a microwave, it's hot for a second, you can hold it for a second before it gets too much, and then you have to drop it again. So he's saying that your body can stand those kind of G-forces for a second or two, and then it alters. But maybe that's his interpretation of maybe how they worked. But obviously, other people say that the occupants of UFOs don't actually feel anything at all anyway. What sort of thoughts do you have on that, Ben?
Oh, he really was in very, very good standing. He was a very respectful character because of his scientific background, which is unusual. I mean, it's totally, it runs completely 90 degrees to the stereotype of the guy with the woolly hat and the anorak standing on a hillside at night with a camera, looking at cameras and telescopes. No offense, Winkeech, but that is the stereotype, isn't it?
You've got to have a thermal flask as well.
Exactly. The thing is, Stan didn't fit into the stereotype, and this made him also. This didn't only give him an additional credibility; it made him an excellent speaker, an excellent lecturer, and explainer, and the ability to, because he had the common touch. He could put these things into non-technical terms. Use simple language for laymen and things like that, but it's obvious he knew what he was talking about. I mean, the debates he did with people, and that he with Philip, the ones particularly like with Philip J. Klass, with Michael Shermer, and with Andy what's his name, Bill Nye, and these people, they're incredibly entertaining to watch because he completely and utterly eviscerates them. He eviscerates and disintegrates them almost effortlessly. And these are the noisy negativists, as he calls them. Of course, they won't be convinced. Nothing will convince them. But this is I think his forte was the language, his explanations. His books were excellent. I've only read one of his books. I read Crash at Corona, which is about the Roswell incident. But he was an astonishing. He was an astonishing person who I can't think of the word right now, but he's astonishing at explaining things and publicizing and making people understand, facilitator of comprehension.
Did he have any formidable experiences himself, like really kind of unexplicable, beyond kind of like weather balloons or aircrafts or mysteries, but actual, full-on triangles with weird flashing lights and that?
No, he didn't. And there was a very bad obituary published about him by the Daily Mirror, where they, in the title, it said a ufologist dies who's never seen a UFO, and that was in the headline, for goodness sake. And I thought, what an awful thing to say. I mean, how stupid is that?
It's a bit crass.
It's disrespectful, and it's a cheap shot. But it's what you'd expect from the fake news. They're going to say things like that. So I wasn't surprised. I mean, there's been a much better, far better, more respectful tributes have been paid to him from within the UFO community. Really, we do feel that we have lost one of our legends. This is and of course, whenever an old pioneer does fall off the perch, it is a kind of it's like a turning point within that community, within that movement. I feel now that this is going to affect all of us, because Stan Friedman, of course, he was old, he was semi-retired, but he was still there. Now he's not there anymore, suddenly. This represents a major watershed within our community and within our movement. So where it'll go from here, I don't know. Of course, no one can replace him. He is unique in every single way. But
do you see any successors that are kind of behind him, in a sense? I mean, you mentioned Richard Dolan earlier. I kind of see him as a kind of, not a successor because he doesn't know physics and things like that, but he's got quite a good research ability, hasn't he?
Yes, he's a political scientist, and he's very good. Dolan is very good indeed. And of course, no one will replace Stan, but of course, there's lots of other people who will carry on his work and honor his legacy, including myself. There's many people who will continue his what he's doing. Richard Dolan is one of them. There's others. There's people like Stephen Bassett, who is a political activist. He's a lobbyist. There's people such as Gary Heseltine, who's a journalist, a magazine editor. There's everyone in their own way is, in a sense, picking up the baton which Stan has now dropped. And so this absolutely is not the end. It's absolutely not. No way. If we're even thinking this is somehow the end of anything, then we've been wasting our time for the last 70 years. And of course, we haven't been wasting our time. Stan was a much better teacher than that, and there's no way that he would have kept all the eggs in his own basket. He has inspired and educated an entire generation of successors, and I think that's we'll see that more and more as things go on, and especially as these revelations come out, his name is going to become better known.
I think it's interesting that he almost became a researcher accidentally, because I seem to recall a story where he said that he was in this book club many years ago, before the internet ever came along, before Amazon was ever a thing. you had to do mail order, and you'd get a book list through, and he ordered a few books, and I think he said that he ordered this old paperback of Flying Saucers Are Real or something like that, because if you ordered a third or fourth book in this deal, he'd get free postage. So literally said, just to get the free postage, I thought, I'll have a Flying Saucer book to get the free postage, and he actually read that and was really taken with it. And that's the whole thing that steered him down into UFO research. So I thought that's an interesting story.
Oh, that is amazing. That's an amazing. I mean, of course, UFOs Are Real by Donald Kehoe is an absolutely seminal book. And it's inspired many, many people. Major Donald Kehoe, he went out on a limb really in the very beginning of the UFO era and spoke out about the whole subject. And of course, Stan was one of the people who he, I think, created in a sense.
So now we've left. Stan's now left us, and so, like you said, there's other people there that are good contenders to take over from him, and he's left us almost at this pivotal point where we're getting all this information now coming through, possible hints of disclosure, certainly exciting things that we'd never had before. Where are we going to go next with it, do you think, Ben?
Oh, I mean, I really couldn't say, but it does seem there's something fateful almost about the timing of his passing, because as you said, I feel we're now entering a really exciting era where almost anything could happen. New information popping out all the time. I don't know exactly where it's going to go, but it does seem like almost like the timing of his passing. It's almost like he's done what he came to the earth to do, and now he has to move on. It's almost like that kind of feeling about it, as if he's not needed anymore. Now he can have a real rest.
Now you actually, for the second half of our show, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've got a slightly different format tonight. We've Ben has kindly allowed us to use an interview that he did with Stanton back in 2013. Was it, Ben?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So Ben's Hipanwa radio show, Ben was fortunate enough to manage to get Stanton on his show. Now, how did that come about, Ben?
Oh, it's very, very interesting, because this came at a very interesting time. In fact, this is a very important interview that Stan gave, because this was during the citizen hearing in 2013, which is organised by Grant Cameron, Stephen Bassett, and several other people, where they basically it was like almost a repeat of the original 1969 Condon Committee and the hearing that followed that. 1968 rather. Yet this had lots of updated information since then. Now, of course, the US government didn't carry out a hearing of its own, although it probably will soon now. But it's what they did was they got together some former members of the US Congress. These are elected officials that are now retired and are left, and they got them to carry out a facsimile of a congressional investigation at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And it went on for a whole week. All the witnesses, all big witnesses were there. There was people involved in the Rendlesham Forest UFO case. There was Captain Bob Salas was there, and many other people. The omnipresent and inevitable Nick Pope, of course, and one of them was Stanton Friedman. And I did a series of radio shows. I thought this was so important. I did a series of radio shows where I interviewed several people who were actually involved in the hearing, and one of them was Stanton Friedman. I just emailed him and said, "Look, I'm doing these shows. I'd love you to come on the show." He answered back, "Yeah, sure, it'd be great." So he gave me his phone number and got onto Skype, and we recorded a little interview, which you're about to play. And it's a very, very interesting interview, and it was great to talk to him. I met him as well a few years later it was actually last year at the UFO Truth magazine conference. Or the year before, 2017 UFO Truth magazine.
He came to Holmfirth.
He did, yeah. He spoke there, and I met him. It was lovely to meet him, and he did a really, really good talk with Gary Hasseltine. And again, it's an amazing honour to have such a magnificent giant of a figure within our community to appear at the conference, and as it was to have him on my show.
Because Philip, who was going to be on tonight, he met him out in America, I believe, at a conference, along with the other lady that's I think it was a nephew of Betty and Barney Hill. Sorry, the niece.
Kathleen
that's it. Because they had written a book together. He had helped her write a book on their case, which was initially the interrupted journey of their encounter, coming actually out of Canada I believe, back in, was it the early 60s or something?
It was 1961, and they would actually been to New Hampshire. I don't think they'd been all the way to Canada, but they were on holiday. This couple, they were driving home to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, late at night, and basically they had what could only be described as a classic close encounter of the third kind. Now, this is not. They weren't the first people to have these. Yeah, they're often called the first alien abductees. They weren't, but they were first to be publicised. They were first really to be publicised. Now, Betty Hill had a niece called Kathleen, and Kathleen has become very active in the UFO world. And she's written this book with Stanton Friedman, which is called Captured. And there's it's an important case, which is unfortunately they're both dead now. Barney died in the late 60s, just a few years after the event, but Betty lived until I think around about 2000, and she never changed her story. She did an interview a couple of years before she died where she told the very same story she had told originally. She stood by what had happened to her and her husband.
Now, did Stanton regard that as maybe one of the best cases in his opinion? I mean, what was the best case that he would put on record and say this is the ultimate UFO case?
Well, I mean, there were many. I mean, this particular one, with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, he took very seriously. Otherwise, he would not have written the book. But there were many others he regarded as very important. The Roswell Incident, of course. He looked into several others, such as the Virginia Incident of 1996, I believe. He said that was very significant. This is a case very similar to Roswell, actually, that happened in Brazil, at a place called Virginia, where aliens were seen. It was unlike Roswell. This was a densely populated urban area. There was a crash retrieval. They captured some aliens that escaped and things like that. He regarded that as very important and very significant. And I can't say what else it was, but I know that these were ones that spring to mind where he commented.
Well, we shall now take a listen to your recording. So thank you, Ben, for taking part in our Paranormal Peep Show tribute to Stanton Friedman. Andy, any last words before we listen to the recording?
I was just going to ask Ben. We've spoken about whether Stanton believed in any cases. Did he actually prove any cases to be fraudulent or any people to be fraudulent at all?
I don't know specifically. I mean, the ones that are proved to be fraudulent, you usually find out later on. Usually they're not really talked about much. I don't know if he personally actually debunked any. I mean, he always believed Bob Lazar was fake, and several other people, a lot of other people went along with him. But that's never been definitively proven to be fraud in my opinion, and the opinion of others. It's never been proven to be a fraud.
Well, what makes you think? What makes you think that Bob Lazar? Because I don't know either way, and I haven't got a preference either way. But what do you think makes him credible?
It's the way the things he says, the way the fact that he's actually not gained anything for making this hoax. If it's a hoax, he would actually gain an awful lot more if he simply came clean and said, "Hey, I fooled the world." I mean, that would be a money spin. That's kind of thing is really, really lucrative, but he won't do it. There's also really the Wilson notes. This new piece of evidence is one of the most important things to come out, which kind of backs up his story. I mean, there's no direct link, but I mean, it talks about a similar scenario to the one he talks about.
Interesting.
Well, on that note, then we shall say thanks very much, Ben, for taking part in our show tonight.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Cheers, Ben.
We wish you better. Good speedy recovery. We also wish Philip Kinsella a speedy recovery, and sorry he couldn't join us, but I hope he's listening anyway. And so maybe we'll get Philip on at a later time to discuss his research, because he's always welcome. So we'll take a listen now to the interview that Ben did back in 2013 with the late Stanton Friedman. Thanks very much for listening, everyone.
Stanton Friedman, welcome to Hapanwo Radio. How are you this evening?
Oh, pretty good here in beautiful downtown Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada.
Oh, that's beautiful. New Brunswick, I've been looking it up, and it looks like a lovely place. And
it is.
It's now 11 p.m. where I am, but I know it's a bit earlier for you, isn't it?
4 hours earlier.
Yeah, these time zones are a bit difficult to get used to. But now you yourself, are you a physicist or an engineer or something like that?
Nuclear physicist, retired, you might say.
Because you seem to have quite a mainstream kind of background, before you, alongside your ufology.
Well, what's not mainstream about ufology?
Well, quite a lot.
I worked for 14 years in industry as a nuclear physicist. Little companies like General Electric, Westinghouse, General Motors, McDonnell Douglas, TRW Systems, Aerojet General Nucleonics. My specialty was canceled government-sponsored research and development programs. Not intentionally, but that's the way it turned out. Nuclear airplanes, fission rockets, fusion rockets, nuclear power plants for space and earthling applications. It was all very exciting. I got interested in flying saucers in 1958 when I read a book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Air Force Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. He was the first Project Blue Book head. Blue Book was supposedly the only U.S. government group concerned with UFOs. That's a lie, but that's what they said.
Yeah, we'll get into that, won't we?
I read the book. It intrigued me, and my neighbor was even more intrigued than I was. I was young. I was 24, working at General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department. That was not a small program, incidentally. People think it must have been a little paper study. We employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. And in 1958, when I read Ruppelt's book, we spent $100 million.
That's a lot.
At that time, that was a lot of money.
Yeah.
Very exciting program. I also worked on fission rockets and fusion rockets. And the reason I mention those things is that one of the major objections on the part of the nasty, noisy negativists to flying saucers, you can't get here from there. It's like saying you can't get from England to New Brunswick, where I live, in less than 2 weeks, because that's how long it takes a big ship to get here.
Yeah.
But you can choose to fly, and it's less than a day. So if you use a dumb old chemical rocket, of course you can't get to the stars. Why would any rational person do that? Technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. And you can get the idea when you realize that Magellan, in 1523, his ship, he didn't make it, but his ship did, took 3 years to go around the world. Well, Nellie Bly did it around 1870 in about 80 days, a little less than 80 days. Getting better.
Like Phileas Fogg in the story.
Yeah, exactly. And the kicker is, though, the space station today goes around the world in 90 minutes.
Yeah, and I mean, back in those days, there were noisy negativists, as you call them, which is a great term, I think. Even when the Wright brothers first flew and they took photographs of their plane in flight, so there were people who said that's fake. That's a fake photograph, and they didn't believe it.
That's one of the things. I'm a co-author of a book called "Science Was Wrong." 14 chapters, each of them stimulated by a smart person saying something stupid. It's time for a second volume, but the biggest astronomer in the United States stated that if there was one thing he was sure of, that man would never fly any distance in a vehicle. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight.
Yeah.
The British astronomer Royal, and they've got a lot of stupid things after their names, in 1956 said space travel is utter bilge. What good would it do? Nobody would spend the money. What we need is better instruments for astronomers. And of course, Sputnik went up the next year, and the science that's benefited the most from space is astronomy, of course.
Yeah, it's Hubble Space Telescope, things like that.
Yeah, all kinds of things. And, there are many, many other examples, medical examples, and so forth. So I'm one of these people who says, show me, give me the facts, give me the data. And what I found is there's 4 basic rules for debunkers. 1, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. 2, don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Yeah.
3, if you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. And 4, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble. And who's going to know the difference anyway?
Yeah, I could think of a few more, actually. It's a bit too big a subject, but I've listed a few more. Yeah, it is an art form, these skeptics with a K, as I call them. It's an absolute art form that they have got it down to. Now,
except when they run into people like me, because I've given over 700 lectures in all 50 states, all 10 provinces, and 18 other countries. I've heard all the objections.
Mm.
None of them stand up under careful examination.
Exactly. I actually first heard of you when I saw you in a TV show debating a man called Professor Chris French, who's
oh yes,
he's a very, very well known skeptic in Britain. Now, presumably, I mean, in this case, there's always people don't expect what's going to happen now in the future, like air travel, like space rockets and things like that. Now, UFOs, I think, and I'm sure you agree, are in this same category. Soon, a lot of people don't believe in them now, but the idea that there are beings outside our Earth, outside our world, and they're visiting us is at the moment fringe. But
well, it's strange how that is. Now, the SETI community, searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, but it really means silly effort to investigate, is based on the assumption that there's life out there, but they ain't coming here.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why would you listen with a radio telescope if there was nobody sending a signal?
Mm.
And so many people say there's life out there, but not coming here because you can't get here from there. You can't stand the acceleration. The governments can't keep secrets. Yeah. These standard lines. My Skype webpage says error here.
I can still hear you perfectly. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So we'll just carry on then.
Yeah. The kicker here is that there's a lot of data. The noisy negativists don't know anything about that data. And I'm a little sneaky. In many of my lectures, I'll talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies. I'll give the data, show the cover, the slide, and then ask how many people here believe they've read this report. If I'm lucky, it's 1 or 2%. So this cuts down the noise from the nasty, noisy negativists, or the ancient academics, or fossilized physicists, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah. It's good name. There's a guy called Mark Thomas, I think, who really gets on my nerves. Do you know Mark Thomas?
I don't know if I do or not.
I think that's his name anyway, but yeah. Sorry, carry on.
Now, we have people like that in the States, too, of course. So my job is to provide data, facts, solid information, and also to take advantage of the fact that I've probably been asked between classrooms and radio and television shows about 50,000 questions. And so I've heard them all before. And the most popular questions are the why questions. The data shocks people, but okay, it's data. They show the tables from the report, the information. But they want to know about the why question. Why would aliens come here? Why don't they land on the White House lawn? Americans are a little, if anyone's come here, it's going to be the United States.
That's very much anthropomorphizing in a way, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's even worse than that. It's nationalisticizing.
Yeah, I mean, it's very. We do this sometimes with animals because I mean, I see dogs and I see them smelling the ground and I think, what the hell are they doing? Why are they urinating against lampposts? And of course, I don't know that. They know it because they're dogs. I'm a human. I don't understand what they're doing. They're dogs. They don't understand everything I do.
Well, we should understand a few things about ourselves. I believe that every civilization is concerned about its own survival and security. If they weren't, they wouldn't exist very long.
Yeah.
That being the case, you have to keep tabs on the primitives in the neighborhood, but only close tabs on those primitives who show signs of being able to bother you. In other words, you want to make a mess of your planet, that's no problem, but you want to make a mess of my planet, that's a big problem. At the end of World War II, there were 3 signs that soon these idiot Earthlings, who had just killed 50 million Earthlings and destroyed 1,700 cities, were a threat to the neighborhood. Within 100 years, they'll be out here bothering us. And the 3 signs: nuclear weapons, powerful rockets used to kill people like the V2, and radar, which was the beginning of the electronics revolution. It is interesting indeed that the only place on the planet in July 1947 where it could study all 3 of these was southeastern New Mexico. That's where Trinity Site is, where the first A-bomb was exploded, July 15th, 1945. That's where we were firing to capture German V-2 rockets. And that's where we had our best radar, because sometimes the rockets went the wrong direction. Very embarrassing. Now, and that's where Roswell is, of course.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because that's
Yeah.
that's where anybody out there who wanted to know what the Earthlings were up to, and like I said, as Jim Mars put it he put it even more succinctly. He said, "Oh my God, the kids have found the matches."
Yeah, the genie's out of the bottle, you know,
Yeah.
and he's right. I mean, wouldn't you be concerned if you were an alien? You wouldn't want us out there. Look at our track record.
Well, no, as you said, we just done something completely illogical and ridiculous, which is kill millions of our own species.
50 million.
Yeah, I mean it's a
Some
vast.
people say 60, but you can tell I'm a very conservative guy.
Yeah. But we just committed mass slaughter on our own species, which is is not a good survival mechanism. Now, this reminds me actually. We'll go on to comment to Roswell in a minute, but Dr. Jacobs, which I know there's two Jacobs in ufology. Which one am I talking about? But he's the guy.
You mean Robert or David?
The guy who took the photographs of the missile launch.
That's Robert.
Robert
Yes.
Jacobs, yeah. I mean, there's a very, the mess. Just to briefly explain to listeners, there was a nuclear missile test, which was an attempt to launch a nuclear device into space. There's rumours that they intended to explode a nuclear device on the moon.
Not that one.
Oh right, but during the test launch, anyway, there was the rocket was actually interfered with by a UFO, and it exploded, blew up. And then there's a message behind that, which is, we don't use if you're going to use nuclear weapons, keep them on your own planet.
Well, yeah, that rocket wasn't going to go into space or on the moon.
Oh right,
but,
getting mixed up there.
And there's another case where 10 Minuteman missiles, nuclear tip missiles, were at a silo in Montana, and all of a sudden there was a UFO showed up. The guy upstairs saw it, called the man down in the silo, and he thought he was joking, and he called back in a couple of minutes very upset. It's right over the gate here, and then all 10 missiles went down. Now, supposedly, there's no way you can do that.
No, I mean,
it's not easy, you can imagine.
They're all designed to be fail-safe.
That's right. And something like that has happened in the Soviet Union as well, and at several other missile sites.
Yeah.
People are speaking out. And as a matter of fact, at this past week's citizens' hearing on disclosure, I could tell that the former congressmen who were listening to testimony from a bunch of us, they were particularly impressed, I thought, with the testimony of the missile guys.
Oh, yes, Captain Salas and Captain Schindler.
Salas, and yes. And the kicker is those guys get tested for their mental stability. You know, you don't want a guy with his finger on a button that can launch a nuclear tip missile who isn't stable.
Exactly, yeah.
And, you know, it's not drinking down there and all kinds of other things. So the amount of data that's available is much greater than the noisy negativists think it is.
Yeah.
I'm particularly upset by the fact that the astronomers, for example, all of them know that the stars produce their energy throughout the universe, not just the galaxy or the neighborhood, by a process called nuclear fusion. They all know that. But none of them seems to think of the fact that maybe you could use that process for propulsion. Now, the Navy has used nuclear fission for propulsion. And people look at me, what are you talking about? I said, well, in the first place, I've worked on fission rockets, which we've operated. Los Alamos' largest one, less than 8 feet in diameter, had a power level of, would you believe, 4,400 megawatts. That's twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam. That was tested in the late 60s. That's nuclear fission. But the Navy is the best example. You've got nuclear-powered submarines.
They're common now, yeah.
Many people don't realize. The first one was in the mid-50s.
There was Rickover in the Nautilus, isn't it?
That's right. Dear Admiral Rickover, he's one of my... He said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, somebody else said.
Yeah. Well, of course, I mean, we have nuclear submarines in many countries now, including the Royal Navy here in Britain has them.
Yes, that's what I said. You've got them. But remember, there's not only the submarines. There's the nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. And many people don't realize that they can operate for 18 years without refueling.
Yeah. It's basically you need enough food. As long as you get enough food on board the ship, you can just stay at sea.
Yeah, you got to get food, and you need a few doctors around in case people get sick. But 18 years is a heck of a long time, and a lot of diesel fuel you're not burning.
Yes, and
let me go to the next step, though. Man has moved toward the nuclear very rapidly. A big bomb.
We're on.
Is remarkably good when it comes to building better methods of destruction. In 1944, a large bomb used in the European conflict was a 10-ton blockbuster, 10 tons of dynamite or TNT, whatever you want to call it. And it was a pretty big bomb, and it took a big B-29 to carry it. That was in 1944. The next year, 1945, our first atomic bomb, our fission weapon, between 16 and 18,000 tons of TNT. That's the destructive power. That's not just a little improvement. Now, 7 years later, we were working real hard, and we used nuclear fusion, our first H-bomb. It was called Mike, incidentally.
Oh, that's
don't
a sweet
ask me
name.
why, because I don't know. But
they tend to give
Pacific,
them names like that, yeah.
Tested out in the Pacific, 1952, released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT. But we Earthlings weren't finished yet. The Russians set off one a few years later, over 50 million tons of TNT.
Oh, God, that was the Emperor bomb, wasn't it?
No, they had other names. Yes, that was a good name for it.
But it was a horrible thing.
Yeah, I mean, but that tells you something about mankind, doesn't it?
Yes.
And one of the amazing things of the last 60 or so years is that we've exploded over 2,000 nuclear weapons, but none of them on people after those first two on Japan. Yeah. I don't know how we managed it, but...
somehow we're still here.
Yeah, the point is that I worked on a study of fusion propulsion system, H-bomb stuff, if you will, in 1961, and if you use the right stuff in the right way, you can kick particles out the back end of a fusion rocket that have 10 million times as much energy per particle as they can get in a dumb old chemical rocket. Not 10 times, 10 million times. So anybody with any smarts in industry as opposed to in academia would realize if you want to spend the money, you can build a fusion weapon.
Yeah.
I mean, and we know you can do that. And a fusion propulsion system for deep space travel. So we only figured out that it was fusion that, made up the energy in the universe in 1938. And already we're at the point where we're using it for massive destruction.
Yeah.
And so any smart alien would recognize you don't want to let these boys out in the open.
No, we're not
because
the
they
kind of
cannot be trusted.
Yeah, we're the kind of the nasty people who live on the end of the street, which everyone crosses over the road to avoid.
Yeah, and remember that this year, we Earthlings, or as the science fiction writers say, Terrans, we will spend a cool $1 trillion on things military. That tells you a lot about the people on this planet, doesn't it?
That's one of the biggest things we spend our money on is weapons.
Of course. So people say, why don't they land on the White House lawn? The president doesn't speak for 7 billion Earthlings. More important, it's a no-fly zone. And who would want to treat us as equals? I don't talk to the squirrels in my backyard. They like nuts too.
But I mean, it's this could, if there are creatures out there are beings out there who are investigating this, wherever they come from, the first thing they're going to be keeping an eye on is our nuclear facilities. And I'll tell you something. I mean, Captain Salas and Captain Schindler were talking about nuclear weapons and their own contact with UFOs. I took a photograph when I was on holiday in Scotland. I was just taking a photo of a nice view, and there was a distinct object in the print when it came out. I didn't see anything at the time, but there's a distinct object. Regular Hapanwo radio listeners will know about this because I've told this story many times. Now, it was only later I realised that you look down at further, and you see a place called Faslane, which is actually the home of the Trident nuclear missile system and the submarines. Yep, and this object is right above them. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
Isn't that interesting?
Yep, it's keeping its eye on nuclear activities.
Well, I don't blame them because that's where we're the biggest threat.
Yeah, there was a similar incident in 1964 in which somebody took a photograph, and what came out on it was actually an alien in what looked like a white suit. And this was right next to where, well, it's not far from where they designed a missile called the Blue Streak missile, which they were testing at that very moment in Australia.
Well,
and again, is that a coincidence? Is it all? Are we all crazy? So. No, absolutely not.
Nice thing about radiation, you can detect it from a distance with sensitive detectors. You don't need to come up and open it up and check it out, find its DNA or that kind of thing.
Yeah. Now, there's a neat little kind of continuity here because you, of course, attended the citizens' hearing that's just concluded, along with last week's guest Peter Robbins, and the week before we had Stephen Bassett. Now, you were actually, I think you may be the only person who was at that citizens' hearing who actually attended the last official congressional hearing in 1968. Is that right?
Not quite. I didn't attend. I contributed. They had 6 scientists in person and 6 more of us in writing only. I was one of the latter group, but I was one of the 12 scientists who participated. Interestingly enough, I was the youngest, and I'm the only one who's still alive as far as I can tell. And
Hello, Stan? Hello? Hi, Stan, can you hear me? Oh, slight problem there. It'll soon be right. Hold on, just going to try and get the call back now. That's Stanton. All right, we're back on the edge. Just a few technical problems there, listeners. Sorry about that. We've got Stanton Friedman back on the show now. So we were just talking about UFOs and their interference with nuclear facilities. Now, one of the places, like you said, where the first place where nuclear weapons were stored was Roswell Army Airfield, was it not?
Well, yeah, Roswell was unique, and I get a real kick out of some Australians who, when they saw the headline RAAF, the capture's saucer, they thought it meant Royal Australian Air Force, and they tried to give me
it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Roswell Army Airfield. Yeah, the group at Roswell in July 1947, when the big event took place, was the most elite military group in the world. It was the 509th. They dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, atomic bombs. They dropped 2 more in Operation Crossroads in 1946. And they did indeed have nuclear weapons on the base. So the people there was an elite force, high-level clearance, hand-picked officers and men. So it wasn't a bunch of GIs sitting around with nothing to do so they should make up a story.
Yeah.
And remember, it was 2 weeks after Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting of June 24th. He was a pilot who spotted 9 objects moving across the sky in a peculiar fashion. First, very rapidly, more than 1,200 miles an hour, he clocked them with the clock on the dashboard of his airplane. But more important, it was like, as he described it, like skipping a rock across the water, like skipping a saucer across the water, he said. And that the newsmen picked up on that. So within days, there were reports all over the United States. It was quite a big thing.
That's where that word came from, flying saucer.
Yeah, it was from Kenneth Arnold. And the word UFO didn't come into use for years after that. And I usually lecture on flying saucers are real or flying saucers in science. And people say, why don't you use UFO, Stan? It's so much more respectable. Well, because all flying saucers are UFOs, very few UFOs are flying saucers.
That's
all
a good point.
Great-grandfathers are men. Not all men are great-grandfathers. I'm interested in flying saucers. I'm also a great-grandfather, but that's beside that.
Well, a UFO, of course, is just something. It's just an object that's flying, which you can't identify, literally.
Yeah.
That could be a strange kind of kite. It could be an unusual bird. It could be an unusual aircraft. It could be
Venus, or all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I don't care about them. It's just like, because I'm a nuclear guy, I'm accustomed to dealing with things that are Well, a small percentage of isotopes are fissionable. I don't care about the ones that aren't if I'm going to build a nuclear reactor. It's just like a basketball coach knows most people aren't 7 feet tall. But give him one of those and you can have all the midgets you want. You got to focus on what's relevant. All the chemicals that don't cure a disease aren't of much use for you if you're trying to cure diseases. So most UFOs can be explained as conventional phenomena. Okay, having said that, let's forget it. Every large-scale scientific study has shown a substantial number, typically 20%, sometimes 30%, of cases that can't be explained. And some people will try to say, well, it's only 5%, Stan. Well, Blue Book Special Report 14, biggest study ever done for the Air Force, 21.5%. The University of Colorado study, the Condon Report, 30% of 117 cases studied in detail.
I find these figures vary depending on who you're talking to, I often find.
Well,
these ratios.
Yeah, they're much greater than most people think they are.
Yeah.
And in addition, in Blue Book Special Report 14, for example, they did a cross-comparison between the unknowns, the only ones we're interested in, and the knowns. They found the probability was less than 1%. The two groups simply do not match, that the unknowns are just misknowns. And the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. So there's all kinds of data, but the noisy negativists never talk about that data.
Yeah.
My University of Chicago classmate, Carl Sagan, said there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable, there are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but there are no interesting and reliable sightings. Absolutely false. Of course, it gives no source of information, no reference. The facts in the biggest study done for the Air Force show exactly the opposite.
Yeah, and I always say about
reliability, the more likely to be unexplainable.
Yeah, I always say the thing about Carl Sagan. I often look at him and I think, how can a guy who's so clever be so dumb?
Well, it may be that he was on the inside and didn't want to show it. I don't know.
Maybe you've been watching Dark Skies with Bryce Zabel's series.
Yeah.
Where he appears in it, yeah.
Speaking of Bryce, you should be informed that he and his cohorts have taken the movie option on my book, Top Secret Magic, Magic.
Yeah. I didn't realize you wrote that book, but Bryce did tell me about it, yeah.
I did write it, and I'm hoping that they'll do the movie. The script has gone through 4 iterations already, had some good response. I want Richard Dreyfuss to play me, of course. But,
he'd be good. Well, he was great in Close Encounters.
That's the point. And he's younger than I am, but we won't tell him that.
Yeah, fair enough. You don't make that don't make that broadcast. Yeah.
The kicker here is there's loads of data and loads of false proclamation by the nasty, noisy negativists. And when I hear the SETI guy saying there is no evidence for UFOs, when you look carefully, they don't refer to any of it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means they're unwilling to look at the evidence. I mean, and let's face it, you can understand that. Who needs a radio telescope if these guys are coming here? Maybe you need to learn sign language.
Yeah, it's I saw a great cartoon of a guy staring through a telescope, a SETI man, and then right in front of him is a UFO, and there's an alien getting out of it.
Yeah, of course. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up.
Yeah, so I often find it's almost a kind of emotional reaction that these people are getting towards something which it's just something they find uncomfortable thinking about. It's a reality or something they want to face. They don't want to face it. They have some kind of emotional reason for not wanting to be true.
There's a syndrome. You find somebody who's a bright person who takes great pride in keeping track of what's important on this planet. And that person also believes that if aliens were visiting, that would be important. They don't deny that. And furthermore, if the government was covering it up, that would be important. However, because it keeps track of what's important, if he doesn't know about them, it can't be real. He would know about it if they were. So there's not going to be any waste of time studying something that can't be. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
I won't look at the evidence, and I'll be happy in my ignorance. And, that's the way it is in many areas. And as I mentioned in my book of Science was wrong. There are many examples over history. Look, plate tectonics. Took 40 years for the idea to get accepted because everybody knew it couldn't be, although any 10-year-old could tell you if you look at a globe, South America and Africa seem to fit together if you push them together, don't they?
Yeah.
You know, that's the kind of thing you got to watch out for, the closed-mindedness.
It's like, come off at continents, drifting? That'd be daft. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also, I think, Stan, I spoke about this with Peter Robbins. There's also distinctive political reasons as well. It's the implications of this fact being a fact, the fact that this has been real and being accepted as real. There's enormous implications in terms of our culture, in terms of our psychology, in terms of our political and economic structures.
No question about it. And I don't want full disclosure, despite having participated in this last week's discussions about disclosure. I believe there is a legitimate national security aspect here. That I worked under security for 14 years. If we, or the Russians or the Chinese, have data that they've learned from crashed saucers or observations with instruments of flying saucers, etc., it may be useful in the development of military systems. Yeah. Why should Russia, China, or the U.S. put what it knows out on the table if the other guy isn't going to? The basic rule for security is you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies.
Yeah, well, the spies always pick it up anyway, don't they? This is
Yeah, I mean, they read the newspapers, they listen to the radio. So if you have to really be careful about not releasing data. That's why stealth aircraft could be developed at a cost of $10 billion in 10 years without anybody blowing the whistle on it. A lot of people involved. And, you know, during World War II, the United States was working on nuclear weapons.
Manhattan Project, yeah.
Yeah, and to get uranium-235 in a high concentration, you took a uranium hexafluoride gas and you pumped it through nickel screens, I'll call them, barriers, and the lighter one goes through more quickly. And by the time you get to the other end of the facility, it's slightly enriched and you run it back through. Now, the kicker is the building in which this work was done, the gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was 1 mile long and was using 5% of the electrical power being produced in the United States in secret.
My goodness, yeah.
It's impressive. I mean, I've been to Oak Ridge, so I know it's real.
Yeah,
I was doing radiation shielding work on nuclear airplanes there.
And they kept it secret.
And they kept it secret. At one time or another, there were 60,000 people connected with the Manhattan Project. Most of them didn't know what was going on. They were instructed, if this needle on this gauge moves over here, turn this dial over here. And, you know, stuff like that. They didn't need to know.
That's an important lesson here, Stan, because it shows that, you know, if you know what you're doing, you can get lots of people working on something and keep it a secret. You just make sure that you compartmentalize the information. And like the people who make part of it could be there's people at this moment producing things which they think are designed to open jam jar lids, and they're really bound for Area 51 to.
I have another phone ringing.
Oh, right. All right, no worries.
For example, the stealth fighter was developed, as I mentioned, at a cost of $10 billion over 10 years with nobody blowing the whistle. Well, you guys had a very good example of that at Bletchley Park.
Oh, of course.
12,000 people working on the decoding of the German codes, you know, and the translating and so forth. 12,000. Now, you'd think that at the end of the war, there would have been a big announcement. Look what a wonderful job these guys did. It wasn't announced publicly for 25 years. Yeah. The reason was straightforward. We were reading other people's mail besides the Germans, and we kept doing it.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have thought they would have put away an invention like that to one side and says we don't need it anymore. But
well, let me give you another example. The U-2 was sent over the Soviet Union to try to find out what was going on. And we kept it secret because we were violating international law. I say we, I'm an American and a Canadian, so both of us kept it secret.
Yeah, I expect some people in Britain knew about it too and kept it secret.
Well, sure. And finally, the big day came. The Russians kept it secret, incidentally, not for the same reason we did, but because they didn't want to admit to their people that they couldn't shoot it down. When finally they did, then they went public, and we denied it. And then finally Khrushchev showed the pilot, Gary Powers, and the U-2 aircraft and the camera. And I will give President Eisenhower credit for saying, yes, it was a spy plane. We need to know what the Russians are doing, a very secretive society. Well, one of the interesting things is we were working on a spy satellite, the Corona spy satellite. The first one flew successfully in 1960. There had been 12 failures before that. The first one got more information about Soviet installations than all the U-2 flights had preceded it. Now, you'd think they would have trumpeted that wonderful, what an incredible thing they did to find out about that. It wasn't made public for 35 years.
Right, well, there you are. And then you've raised another very, very interesting point, which I want to touch on, and that is the budget of the Stealth fighter, where you said the development of the Stealth was $10 billion.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah,
presumably,
that's a lot of money.
Yeah, presumably, you know, when you're dealing with this amount of money, you have to get it from the exchequer into where you want it, and this where it comes things like the black budget come in. Black
budget estimated at 30 to 50 billion a year.
That's a lot of money. You could do an awful lot with that, definitely.
Yes.
And, of course, there's missing money. I mean, Donald Rumsfeld on September the 12th, 2001, happened to mention that he dropped his wallet, or it's gone down behind a radiator. What was it, 3.8 trillion or something? How was it, 1.8?
Well, it was a lot of money.
It was over, it's trillion something, which is a massive amount of money. Trillion, you know.
Can't find it. Sorry, folks.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, there's all kinds of ways where they could fund whatever they're doing with UFOs. Now, we should actually come on to the UFO subject. Now, we've mentioned Roswell, we mentioned the 509th Bomb Squadron. What exactly was the Roswell Incident? What happened in Roswell in July of 1947?
Well, let me tell you how I found out about it. I was giving a lecture at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, supposed to do 3 interviews at the local television station. I did the first 2. The third reporter was nowhere to be found. This is 1978, well before cell phones were everywhere. Station manager's giving me coffee. He's looking at his watch. He's embarrassed. He knew the people who brought me to the station from the university, and he wanted to get the interview. Out of the blue, he says, you know, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant investigator that I am, I said, who's he? His answer changed my life. He handled the wreckage from one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What?
Blimey, that is quite...
Yeah, kind of a shocker. And I said, what do you know about him? He lives in Houma. I didn't know where Houma, Louisiana was. I've been there since to talk to Jesse. He's a great guy. We're old ham radio buddies. You ought to talk to him. The reporter showed up. I had a busy day the rest of the day. The next morning from the airport, going on my next engagement, I thought, well, I'll try to call this Jesse Marcel in Houma, wherever it was. Called information, got a number, talked to him. Now, as it turns out, and I didn't know it at the time, but in retrospect, he was one of the few people who couldn't deny that he was involved. His name was in newspapers all over the world. And he told me his story, and he was the base intelligence officer at the base where nuclear weapons were stored.
And he was in the newspaper back in 1947, wasn't he? Not in 78, but in 1947.
No, in 47. 47.
Oh yeah,
I was only 13 at the time, so I didn't read the newspapers that day about it, you know. And he was the base intelligence officer. Gets a call from the sheriff that a rancher had brought in some very strange material and was trying to get a reward because one was being offered. This is just a couple weeks after the Kenneth Arnold case. And there was an arrangement that the sheriff would call the base if there was anything that might involve the base. They wanted good relationships, traffic accidents, women complaining, whatever.
Yeah.
And so he called the base, talked to Jesse. Jesse checked out the stuff that he had, like nothing he'd ever seen before. He told his boss, Colonel Blanchard, who said, take one of our counterintelligence corps guy and follow the rancher out there because he said there's loads of this stuff out there. And Colonel Blanchard was worried about, this counterintelligence corps guy, the idea was, who's spying on us? New Mexico is a place where there would naturally be spies, nuclear weapons, rocketry, all kinds of stuff. So they go out there, they spend overnight. The next morning, the rancher shows them this field, the debris field. And here's this stuff, 3/4 of a mile long, a few hundred yards wide, like nothing you'd ever expect to see at a plane crash. Lots of little pieces of very strong, very lightweight material. They pick up a small amount of it. I'm truncating the story here.
Yeah.
They bring it back to town. It's late at night. It's 80 miles, and it's cross country. Wasn't on a road. I had an English reporter, as a matter of fact, ask me, well, why don't you just park your car alongside the road there and go in with a metal detector? There's a good reason. There's no road. It's 10 miles from the nearest road.
We don't have that sort of thing in Britain. Everywhere's close to a road in Britain.
Well, I understand that. And I also pointed out that when she admitted she'd never been to New Mexico, that, New Mexico is twice the size of England and Wales combined, and you had 40 million and they had 1 million people. Population density is extraordinarily different.
Yeah. It's very remote, very open and unpopulated.
Very remote, to say the least. And so, at the time, Colonel Blanchard, they bring the wreckage to back to the base. He tells Jesse Marcel, take this stuff to our headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. The headquarters of the 8th Air Force, famous for its battling in Europe, incidentally. And everybody follows orders. They get there, and General Ramey, head of the 8th Air Force, says, you don't say anything. I'll take care of it. When a general tells a colonel, or a major in this case, what to do, he does it.
Yeah.
Now, I've heard people say, oh, that Colonel Blanchard, he must have been a loose cannon, probably got sent to Siberia for this. Well, as it happens, he got 4 more promotions and was a full 4-star general when he died of a massive heart attack at the Pentagon in the mid-60s. He was Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. He had 4 promotions to get there, so hardly a loose cannon. Yeah. So the story, our article appeared in the newspaper because at the morning meeting, Colonel Blanchard tells the base public information officer, Walter Hout, put out a story saying we've captured one of these flying saucers that people have been seeing all over the country. The press release went out afternoon, so it was too late for the East Coast papers. There's that time zone again, New York and Washington. But from Chicago West, Army captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. About 4 hours later, from General Ramey's office, a second press release went out saying, General thinks it's radar weather gadget. And they staged a launch the next day in Alamogordo, New Mexico, of a radar reflector weather balloon combination. Said that's what it was. Yeah. Now, the notion that Major Marcel and Colonel Blanchard couldn't recognize a weather balloon is absolutely absurd. There were ones released every day at the base. Wind direction, temperature, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, as far as Colonel Blanchard goes, I should point out, so he wasn't punished for what he did for releasing that story.
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, Blanchard got 4 promotions.
So why is that? I mean, you'd think they'd be quite angry with him.
Well, because I think it was a bait and switch. As soon as they took care of it the next day, well, okay, I guess there's nothing to these flying saucers. Very successful.
Yeah, so they wanted to silence him.
They wanted the story. You give them, hand out something, then you kibosh it.
I see. So they were setting up a straw man to knock down.
Yeah, exactly.
I see, right.
Exactly right. And it worked extremely well. If it hadn't been for that late reporter, you'd have never heard of Roswell.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes, I'll admit, I got lucky in my research. I checked with editor and publisher. Oh, there's a newspaper in Roswell. What do you know? I called the Roswell Daily Record, asked for the editor from 47. This is in 78. Long gone. What do you need? Well, it says that the base public information officer, a guy called Walter Hout, it's spelled 4 different ways. Before I could finish the sentence, she says, "Oh, his wife works here."
That's
How lucky can you get?
Yeah.
Walter was from Chicago. What's he doing, 30 years later in a small town called Roswell? Well, he likes it there.
He must have decided to stay, yeah.
Yeah, and so well-known in town. I talked to a lot of people about him, very well respected. And he had a base yearbook. And so I shared the story with a colleague, Bill Moore. In Minnesota, I heard a second story in Bemidji, Minnesota, about a crash saucer in New Mexico. And one of your English actors was quoted in the Flying Saucer Review, an English publication still being published.
Yeah.
A guy named Huey Green.
All right.
Was quoted in the 50s as saying when he was driving from Los Angeles to Philadelphia, he heard on the radio about a crash saucer in New Mexico. He could pinpoint the date because it wasn't a trip he made very often. His son lived in Canada. And early July 1947, my colleague went to the University of Minnesota Library, Periodicals Department, started looking first week of July. There was a story. Gave us names, all kinds of information. In the next year and a half, we found 62 people.
And so basically, the story, since 1947, it just basically been filed away, and it was gathering dust in an archive.
Well, yeah. I don't know what archives it was in. It was there were about 3 or 4 mentions in the what I'll call the UFO literature. Frank Edwards mentioned it, got all the facts wrong. There's a report on the UFO wave of 1947 by Ted Blocher. He only saw the follow-up story that said there was nothing to it. And there were a couple other places. A Look magazine, a Life magazine special had a picture of General Ramey and his adjutant, Colonel Thomas Jefferson Dubose. But they really didn't give me the full story was not known at all. And I got ambitious. I wondered if Dubose was still alive. I knew Ramey wasn't and Blanchard wasn't. And I called West Point and managed eventually to locate Dubose. He was in his 80s. And he told me, I went to visit him, and I visited him in Florida. He told me, standing 3 feet away, he took the call from General Ramey's boss, giving him 3 orders. Get the press off our back. I don't care how you do it. That's an invitation to lie, I think.
Yeah.
Second, send some of that wreckage up here today with one of your Colonel Couriers. General McMullen was in Washington. And third, I don't want you to talk about it ever again, not even with your buddy Roger Ramey. That's an order. Do I need to put it in writing, Colonel? No, sir. When a 2-star general tells a colonel what to do, and they're both from West Point, and they both know each other, he does it. He doesn't say, well, I don't think it's nice to lie. He says, how high do you want me to jump? So I was lucky. I'm not lucky. I worked hard to find him. And there's even a DVD out, Recollections of Roswell, with testimony, first-hand testimony from 27 witnesses, almost all of whom are deceased at this time, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
That's all. I should mention my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, which lists my 5 books and it tells you how to order them and has numerous articles challenging the Air Force and other people. Has my bio on it for people who want to give me a hard time.
Yeah, that's all right. I mean, okay, that's so you can always go there and find out more. So,
okay.
So Stan, what happened basically was some kind of artifact of an extraterrestrial civilization came to grief on the ground in New Mexico.
Yes, probably a mid-air explosion, I better say.
Yeah, because there was that big debris field at which Mac Brazel found, and there was a crash at Corona. There was the title of one of your books, I know.
That's the same crash.
It's the same, yeah. So what was
Corona is the name of the nearest little town, and it was a small town, to where the event took place, 80 miles from Roswell. So it really wasn't in Roswell. It was near Corona.
And basically what happened was the government basically salvaged this object.
Very quickly.
And secretly.
And secretly.
Still,
how could they do that? It's very straightforward. There ain't nobody out there, man.
and to this very day, they've kept that secret.
Very much so. And they've lied. As a matter of fact, the Air Force put out 2 huge reports. The Roswell Report, Truth versus Fiction in the New Mexico Deserts, about the size of a New York phone book. And they lied about me. They put out the fiction.
Yeah.
And in that book, they said that they weren't going to say anything more about Roswell. This was in 1994. In 1997, the 50th anniversary of the Roswell Incident, they issued Volume 2. The Roswell Report, case closed.
Oh, yeah.
Now they had the fourth explanation. The first report had the Mogul balloon explanation.
All right, yeah.
A Mogul balloon was really a train of 20 to 25 balloons, standard, conventional, normal weather balloons, which Major Marcel knew all about, of course. They were tied together with string. And the idea was to make it a constant altitude balloon. They had ballast. They had devices for measuring temperature and pressure and stuff. And the hope was that if the Russians tested an A-bomb, the shock wave, which would be enormous, as we found out, would be picked up by this balloon. That wasn't a very good system, and it was huge. And people say, oh, highly classified, Stan. It wasn't highly classified. The purpose was highly classified.
Yeah.
But none of the equipment was anything special. And if it had been highly classified, they would have had a plane accompany the launches of the balloons. It didn't.
Well, this is
the desert.
This is the biggest unmanned balloon ever built, and it was, like you said, it was just basically a combination of other craft, but other smaller balloons. But the noisy negativists always say that this is real. They have this millennial faith that this time the government is telling the truth.
Well, they're not. If you look at the launches of the balloons and you look at the characteristics of the material, nobody would mistake a Mogul balloon train for anything but a bunch of balloons.
Yeah.
The ranchers saw these things all the time, and they paid attention to them because they didn't want their sheep or cattle eating the darn things.
Yeah.
Also, some of them had a little tag on it. If you return the instrument package, you can collect a few dollars.
Well,
so they didn't just leave them out there. They were a threat to the animals, and wasn't high security.
No, well, if I'd been Mac Brazel, I'd have actually taken it in and I'd have picked up the deposit for it.
Well, that's probably why he went into the sheriff's office, because the people in Corona, where he had gone to do his normal shopping, were telling him about flying saucers. He didn't have a phone. He didn't get a newspaper, so he hadn't heard anything about them. And he told them about this wreckage that was on his ranch, and it was the problem was the sheep wouldn't cross the debris field. Well, and they need to get to water. It gets very hot in New Mexico. Believe me, it does. Absolute guarantee. You want a good sunburn, boy, go to Roswell. It's 3,500 feet altitude and very, very dry. So you get cooked in a hurry.
Yeah.
Often 105, 110 degrees Fahrenheit.
So I mean, do you think the government will change their minds again on this, and there'll be another final declassification?
Well, the fourth volume, that case closed. The third volume said Mogul, and we're not going to say anything more. Well, a few years later, they changed their mind. The fourth volume had the worst explanation yet. This is the one where it says, all this talk about bodies? Well, we did our homework. We found that we had dropped crash test dummies all over New Mexico.
Oh, you gotta laugh.
And that's what it was, this talk about bodies. Well, there are two serious problems with that explanation. None were dropped until 1953, or 6 years later. So we got time travel for crash test dummies. Pretty neat.
Yeah.
Secondly, I talked to the man in charge of the program. I don't know why the Air Force didn't. His picture is in their report. Colonel Madsen. And he told me that there are two important things about the dummies. For the test to be meaningful, they were the same height, 6 feet tall, and weight 175 pounds as pilots.
They'd have to be, yeah.
I mean, for the test to be meaningful, and they were also in flight uniforms, flight garb, if you will. And you say, why would they do that? Because if a pilot jumps out of an airplane at 50,000 feet, the amount of heating or cooling of the body, and at first it's cooling, is very much affected by the uniform you're wearing.
Yeah.
You can understand that.
Absolutely.
And why the Air Force ignored the facts And why they didn't talk to him, I talked to him in person in Albuquerque. It was in the phone book. So it wasn't like it was impossible to find. But the Air Force lied. I mean, I've got a whole article on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com. Government UFO lies. It's a long article. Lots of them.
Well, I mean, it's because Glenn Dennis, who's he knew one of the witnesses. He's a man from Roswell, a local man. He describes what this witness told him these creatures look like, because they saw the bodies were actually recovered as well as the craft. When they salvaged the craft, there were creatures inside this artifact.
Yeah, I was the first to talk to Glenn about what the nurse, Naomi Self, told him, as a matter of fact. We were in in a place where Billy the Kid died, a small town just outside Roswell. And, it's a ways outside, but, measure distances in New Mexico, everything's far from everything else.
Yeah.
And, he told me about that. If you listen to the tape of that conversation, there's mariachis playing in the background.
Sounds like a Western, yeah.
Well, it is Western. How much more Western can you get than, Billy the Kid days? So, yes, the bodies were described. The nurse was found, and then she disappeared. And I found somebody. I made an effort to find people who'd been at the base in 1947. And I found a guy who was now a colonel. He gave me some other names, and I talked to one of them who was an 18-year-old at the time, and in the medical group. So this gal was a nurse, so I figured he's the guy that an 18-year-old in a military base would be interested in the nurses.
Definitely, yeah, of course.
And so I located him, and I gave him the names of all the people from the yearbook and added, she's not in the yearbook, added Naomi's name just in alphabetical order. Didn't say anything special about her. He remembered, well, this one was going out with so-and-so. This gal was from Georgia, and several other things. Clearly, he remembered the women. I threw her name in there. Nothing special. He said, yeah, I remember her. So I bit my tongue, and I said, what'd she look like? Well, she was short and very dark and very pretty. And that's exactly the way Glenn Dennis had described her. And I know the two don't know each other. He was the Undertaker.
Right, because that's a very important revelation, because a lot of the noisy negativists say that Glenn made her up.
Well, I was the first to hear him, and when I hear a guy who was at that base tell me he remembers her and describes her in the same terms, what am I supposed to say? He's lying? He wound up being a high school principal, as a matter of fact, the guy I was talking to. Exactly. So I have every reason to believe him and none not to.
Exactly, yeah. So this is a very, very important piece of evidence. Now, as far as the Roswell incident goes, I mean, so basically it all sort of like is still the U.S. government's position is still what they've just all these various declassifications they keep coming out with different stories. There's no, they're not coming clean on it. But now, the word Roswell. I mean, Roswell, of course, is this city in New Mexico, which is the center of the action for this event. But I think sooner or later the Oxford English Dictionary will introduce the word Roswell as a common noun to refer to these kind of crash retrieval events, because the Roswell Incident is just the most famous of many incidents that happen all over the world. They happen quite regularly, actually. There's several dozen, actually, that have been recorded.
Well, we know of several that I can testify to. One is in the plains of San Augustine at the very same time as Roswell, probably a mid-air collision, about 100 miles away. And I heard about that independently. A third one, and there's just been a book put out last year, The Aztec Incident.
Oh, yeah.
I wrote the foreword for it by Scott Ramsey and his wife, Suzanne. Aztec is a small town in the northwestern corner, in the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and Colorado. And that one happened in March of 1948. And Scott and Suzanne Ramsey did one heck of a lot of investigation. That's why I wrote the foreword. I was so impressed with the work that they did. And it's listed on my website, of course. That was one that was, I'll say, crashed intact on a mesa outside Aztec. And they managed to find people that nobody else had found. We've heard about the story for many, many years. But they got beneath the surface, and they found people who were there who had never talked to anybody, police and others. And it's a very good case.
Were these people?
There was also a case in Varginha, Brazil.
Oh yeah,
I was in Brazil when that story came out, and I was not. I want to. Some people have asked me, well, how come you were in Roswell in 1947? I was not. I was 13 years old that year. It was my bar mitzvah year, if you will. I wasn't investigating UFOs at all.
No, very often, people get
Roswell
forced into it.
Roswell set the tone for the government cover-up, for the attacks by the nasty, noisy negativists. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. And, one of the documents that I hold a lot of stock with, the 3 of the over 100 MJ-12 documents, talks about the crash at Roswell. And I've got people, obviously a fraud. And I've listened to all the objections carefully, and I found none of them stand up. I've said that a lot of those documents are fraudulent, but the 3 good ones aren't.
Yeah, we should say that MJ-12 refers to some documents that have come to light, which appear to be government documents top secret documents referring to this event. And there's a friend of yours, is it Mr. What's his name? The man who's verified the signature. There's someone has verified it as real.
Dr. Bob Wood.
That's him. Yeah.
Hired a forensic examiner.
Yeah.
He verified the signature, and all kinds of objections had been raised, typically with the lack of sense of the noisy negativist. One that I got a real kick out of, Mr. Philip Klass, who's written 4 anti-UFO books, makes all kinds of proclamations. One of the pages, or one of the documents, it came in a roll of film, so you don't have the original paper. Anyway, he said, maybe you didn't notice it's done in the large pica type, not the small elite type, which is standard for the National Security Council, which is mentioned. I will offer you $100 each for every genuine document done in the same size and style type and meeting certain criteria, up to a maximum of 10. You have 60 days. Well, he'd never been to the Eisenhower Library. I've spent weeks there. I was going there anyway. So I went there, found 14 pica type documents. They're easy to spot. The typeface much bigger. Copied them, sent him copies and an invoice for $1,000 because that was the limit, 10. And he paid me, but he didn't tell anybody about paying me. Yeah. He told everybody about challenging me. And funny thing, he's deceased now.
Yeah, I bet he wish he kept his mouth.
He got very upset with me when I published a copy of his check.
I bet he wish he kept his mouth shut now and didn't challenge you and didn't bet you.
He did something to make sure nobody knew, if possible. He has his papers are at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia, and there is no Friedman file, even though we had correspondence for 20 years.
Oh.
He didn't want anybody to know. And I always get a laugh at my lectures when I show the check. And give him credit for being honest. But the notion that you can determine that this document is false on the basis of 9, that's all he had, because he'd never been to the Eisenhower Library.
Yeah.
9 documents done in the small elite type. There are 250,000 pages of National Security Council material at the Eisenhower Library.
Yeah.
Generalized from 9 to 250,000 is typical of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology.
Yeah.
It's irrational. Makes no sense.
Definitely. Now, as far as the Roswell incident goes, I mean, there's been many others since then, and Varginha, I believe, was in 1994, but they go back before Roswell as well. I mean, you know about Cape Girardeau in Missouri?
Yes. Yeah, I located Charlotte Mann, whose grandfather said that he said the last rites over I'll call it an alien for one.
Was that 1945? Was it? What?
No, 1942.
42, right.
Yeah, much earlier. And it appears that, and I located people who knew him, and he was very well thought of, and all the rest of that. And remember, that was early part of the war, and it wasn't the time to either go public with it. I mean, that's what the world needed to know. Oh, there are alien invaders here. We thought you'd get a kick out of that. Ha ha.
There was also a terrible tornado in Port Girardeau a couple of weeks later, and about 30 people were killed, and half the town was knocked down. And that probably, that's probably buried a lot of the news.
Yeah, yeah. So, how many do you need to make the story true? You need one.
Yeah.
Now, you don't need 50.
Have you heard that in 1940, just 2 years before that, there was an actual incident over here in Britain? There was an incident in Gateshead, Tyne and Wear. Have you heard about that?
No.
It's the shame. The problem is there's a lot of these UFO events. There's often a long gap between the event happening and the first research being done. This happened in 1940. The witness didn't come forward until 2008. When he was by then he was an old man. Yeah, he was a small boy when it happened. He was an old man now. He approached Richard D. Hall, who's a very well-known British researcher, with this story about basically an object landed. It didn't crash. It landed in a street in the middle of Gateshead, which is a very large town in northern England, and there was all kinds of creatures there. It was really almost like a kind of menagerie of creatures.
Wow.
It's a really remarkable case. I'll send you the details after the interview.
Okay.
We're almost at the end now, Stanton. But so you've already mentioned your website. You mentioned give it another. Have you mentioned to give it another mention?
www.stantonfriedman. That's FRIEDMAN.com.
Right.
And it lists all my books, and it has a number of articles and some fairly strong statements and data about the more interesting aspects of flying saucers. And, we don't get millions of hits a year. Incidentally, an article about those hearings last week by Lee Spiegel, who writes for the Huffington Post, and who arranged the United Nations hearing at which I was a testifier way back in '78. One of Lee's articles about the hearings, just to give you an idea of the.
I'll have to check that out because
he got over 5 million hits on that article.
Brilliant, because I want to have to check that out. Yeah, there's a lot on that website to keep you interested. If you ever want to know anything about UFOs, that is one of the top sites to go to, I must say. So Stan, we've gone on a long time, but I mean, I'm sure we could talk about a lot more. May have to get you back on again.
Sure.
But thanks very much for being a guest on Panwo Radio. So that was Stanton Friedman, everyone. See you, Stan.
Thank you.